Fossil records, cave drawings, and archaeological digs have all provided evidence that humans have been using psychedelic compounds for thousands of years. And by used, I don't just mean in the stereotypical trip out sense.
Scientists gave people magic mushrooms, then slid them into brain scanners, expecting chaos. But that's not what they found. Instead, parts of the brain actually became quieter. The areas tied to ego, overthinking, and repetitive thought loops suddenly slowed down, while regions that normally never communicate began connecting in completely new ways.
It's not the psychedelic that they're thinking about or that they're having fun with. It kind of power washes you from the inside.
It's something that does approximate a natural religious experience.
You're taking it, you're colonizing it, you're damaging us, you're erasing our cultures.
A gruesome spectacle of how drugs can ruin a brilliant mind.
At first, researchers thought the scans had to be wrong, because the brain didn't look damaged. It looked unusually flexible, almost like normal communication patterns were temporarily being reorganized. And the people coming out of these studies kept saying similar things. I feel different, not intoxicated, different. Some participants in controlled studies reported significant emotional relief after guided sessions. Others described feeling less trapped inside their normal patterns of thinking. And results like these challenged decades of assumptions surrounding psychedelics. Because for years, magic mushrooms had been treated as dangerous substances with no accepted medical use. Yet researchers were now seeing something much more complicated. And once you see how quickly psychedelic research was restricted during the political and cultural backlash of the late 1960s,
advocates have welcomed a surprise decision by Australia's drug regulator to approve 2 psychedelic substances for treating severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. But some experts are worried the move is premature. They're urging caution for the use of therapies they say are promising but ultimately unproven.
the story of magic mushrooms starts looking like something much bigger than a typical drug story. Because this wasn't just about mushrooms, it was about the human mind itself. And to understand how psilocybin went from ancient ritual to banned substance to modern scientific research, we have to go back long before modern laboratories existed. Long before modern science, humans were already using psychedelic mushrooms. Ancient cultures across Central and South America used psilocybin mushrooms during spiritual ceremonies and religious rituals, stretching back thousands of years. To many indigenous groups, these mushrooms weren't treated casually. They were approached carefully, often under guidance and ritual. Some ceremonies focused on healing, others focused on spirituality, reflection, or major life transitions. And interestingly, many descriptions from those ancient traditions sound surprisingly similar to what modern clinical researchers hear today. Feelings of connection, changes in perception, deep emotional reflection. Then, in the 1950s, the Western world rediscovered them. An American writer named R. Gordon Wasson traveled to Mexico and participated in a mushroom ceremony led by healer Maria Sabina. When Wasson later published his experience, fascination spread rapidly. Scientists became curious. Psychologists started researching psychedelics. And for a brief moment, many researchers believed these substances might help scientists better understand the brain itself. But then, the 1960s changed everything. Because psychedelics were about to become connected to politics, counterculture, and fear. By the late 1960s, psychedelics had moved far beyond research laboratories. College students experimented with LSD and mushrooms. Musicians openly discussed altered states of consciousness. Anti-establishment movements were growing rapidly, and governments became increasingly concerned. Psychedelics were no longer viewed only as research substances. They became tied to rebellion, social unrest, and public fear. Media stories focused heavily on panic, dangerous behavior, and psychological horror stories. Public perception shifted quickly. Then, in 1970, the United States passed the Controlled Substances Act. Psilocybin was classified as a Schedule I substance, meaning it was considered to have high abuse potential and no accepted medical use. Research funding disappeared, universities backed away from psychedelic studies, and serious scientific research nearly vanished for decades. But not completely. A small number of scientists quietly continued studying psychedelics behind the scenes, and eventually, new technology allowed researchers to look directly into the brain itself. What they found would restart the entire conversation. In the early 2000s, researchers at places like Johns Hopkins University and Imperial College London began studying psilocybin again under controlled conditions. And brain scans revealed something unexpected. Psilocybin appeared to reduce activity in something called the default mode network. This network is heavily tied to self-reflection, internal dialogue, and repetitive patterns of thinking. In simple terms, it's often associated with the voice in your head, constantly replaying worries, regrets, fears, and self-judgment. During psilocybin experiences, activity in this network appeared to quiet down. At the same time, entirely different regions of the brain suddenly became more interconnected. Researchers described the brain as becoming temporarily more flexible. And that became especially interesting in studies involving depression, addiction, and trauma, conditions often associated with rigid, negative thought patterns. Some participants in controlled clinical studies reported meaningful emotional shifts after guided sessions, not because mushrooms were being presented as miracle cures, but because researchers believed they might help interrupt deeply repetitive mental loops.
I've never read anyone who wrote wiser words about the dangers of psychedelic use than that, because he didn't say, well, none of this is real. He said, it's more real than you want it to be, and so watch the hell out.
And suddenly, psychedelic research was no longer being viewed as fringe science. It was becoming serious again. Today, psychedelics are experiencing what many researchers call a psychedelic renaissance. Universities continue publishing new studies. Therapy clinics are opening in some areas, and public conversations around mental health have changed dramatically. Part of the reason is simple. Millions of people still struggle with depression, anxiety, trauma, and addiction. And while traditional treatments help many people, they don't work for everyone. So when early psilocybin studies began showing promising results in carefully controlled therapeutic settings, people paid attention. But researchers consistently stress something important. Psilocybin is not harmless. These experiences can be emotionally intense and unpredictable. That's why modern studies place enormous emphasis on preparation, screening, supervision, and controlled environments. Researchers also emphasize something called set and setting, meaning a person's mindset and environment can heavily influence the experience. Because despite the growing excitement surrounding psychedelic research, scientists are still approaching these substances cautiously, and that caution matters.
And I spent a lot of time talking to patients, many of whom were dying, about how this single high-dose psilocybin experience, a guided psilocybin experience, the image people have is popping some mushrooms in your mouth and maybe going to a concert or going to the beach, but this is a very controlled internal experience, completely reset these people's attitude toward death and allowed them to die with equanimity. It was one of the most effective psychiatric interventions that these psychiatrists had ever seen.
Because this story isn't really about promoting mushrooms. It's about understanding why researchers became interested in them again after decades of silence. Today, cities like Denver and states like Oregon have started experimenting with decriminalization or supervised psilocybin programs. Public opinion has slowly shifted. Major universities continue researching psychedelics, and discussions that once existed almost entirely underground are now happening openly. But perhaps the biggest shift is happening in how people view mental health itself. For decades, many conversations around mental health focused mainly on managing symptoms. Now, researchers are exploring whether certain therapies might help people process emotions and thought patterns in entirely different ways. Psilocybin research is still developing. Many questions remain unanswered, and scientists continue debating both the risks and potential benefits. But one thing is clear. Magic mushrooms are no longer being treated as a topic science can simply ignore. For thousands of years, humans treated psychedelic mushrooms as something mysterious, spiritual, and powerful. Then, modern society banned them, stigmatized them, and pushed them to the edges of culture. Now, after decades of silence, science is reopening the conversation. Not because researchers are encouraging reckless use, but because the human brain remains one of the least understood things in existence. And sometimes, the most unexpected discoveries come from places society stopped looking a long time ago.